The silent streets of Dumfries, the year was 1862, and the town of Dumfries, Scotland, rested beneath a heavy shroud of mist. The gas lamps flickered against the damp night air, their faint orange glow reflecting on the wet cobblestones. Hooves of horse-drawn carriages echoed in the distance, cutting through the silence before vanishing again into the fog. Dumfries was a place where gossip traveled faster than the river Neath that carved its way through the town. Among the simple stone houses and narrow lanes lived a woman whose name was already whispered with unease, Mary Timney. By day, she was seen in the market, a stern-faced figure wrapped in worn shawls, bargaining with vendors for bread, flour, and lamp oil. To some, she was nothing more than another struggling widow of the working class weathered by life, hardened by poverty. But to those who knew her better, Mary was a storm contained within a fragile shell. The dual image, the locals of Dumfries were no strangers to hardship. Work was scarce, tempers ran short, and survival often bred cruelty. Yet, even in such a harsh climate, Mary's name carried an edge. Neighbors told hushed stories about her sudden outbursts, how her voice could turn sharp as a blade, how her eyes seemed to flash with something wild whenever she felt wronged. "Best not cross Mary Timney," one neighbor once muttered to another, glancing nervously toward her cottage. "She remembers every slight, every insult. She see it paid back, but behind the whispers lay curiosity. What had shaped this woman? What shadows from her past clung to her like the mist over Dumfries? Few dared to ask aloud. A night of unease on certain nights, when the streets grew too quiet and the town seemed to sleep uneasily, Mary would sit alone by her hearth. The flames painted her face in gold and shadow, but her expression remained unreadable. She wasn't the kind of woman to share her inner world. Yet sometimes, when the wind howled through the chimney, she muttered to herself words no one could quite hear, fragments of memory, fragments of rage. Those who passed her cottage swore they could see her silhouette pacing through the window, like a restless spirit trapped in its own cage. Foreshadowing the storm, Dumfries in 1862 was a town balanced on the edge of tradition and change. The Industrial Revolution had begun to seep into Scotland, but in small towns the old ways still ruled. Justice was harsh, punishments public, and reputations fragile. And into this world, Mary Timney's temper would soon collide with fate. A single spark was enough to set her fury ablaze, and that spark, once struck, would lead her down a path to infamy, a path that history would never forget. As the mist thickened that night, cloaking the town in silence, none could know that Dumfries was about to become the stage for a story so grim. It would echo through Scotland's history for generations. For in the weeks to come, Mary Timney's dark past would no longer stay hidden. It would explode into violence, trial, and the final gallows. And the people of Dumfries, they would never forget the woman who went from neighbor to executioner's victim, the last woman hanged in their land. Whispers in the shadows, the mist never left Dumfries for long. It clung to the streets, to the windows of shops, and to the whispers that carried through the marketplace. In every corner of town, people spoke in hushed voices, careful not to be overheard because the subject of their gossip was not just any woman. It was Mary Timney, a reputation in the making. Mary was not old, but life had carved its lines into her face. She had worked hard, struggled harder, and somewhere along the way, a bitterness had settled into her bones. She was known for her sharp tongue, the kind of woman who would never back down from an argument. If a shopkeeper cheated her on a measure of flour, she would slam her fist on the counter until the coins rang out. If a neighbor insulted her pride, she would stand in the street and shout until the whole lane gathered to listen. To some, this was strength. To others, it was a sign of something darker. "She's not like the rest of us," one farmer's wife muttered to another at the well. "There's a fury in her, like fire waiting for oil." The other woman nodded nervously, glancing toward Mary's small cottage at the edge of town. "I and fire once started cannot be stopped." Shadows of the past, there were rumors that Mary's temper was not new. Stories slipped from her past like broken threads. Some claimed she had once fought violently with her own kin. Others swore she had a habit of drinking strong spirits, the kind that made her eyes burn brighter and her words more cutting. Children, ever sensitive to the moods of adults, were warned not to play near her house. "Stay away from Mary Timney's door," parents whispered, "or she'll snatch you up in her rage." These might have been exaggerations born from fear and gossip, but in Dumfries, gossip had the power to shape truth. And Mary's truth was beginning to harden into something ominous. Sparks of rage, the real stories were harder to ignore. Neighbors spoke of shouting matches that lasted deep into the night, of smashed crockery hurled into the yard, of Mary standing in the dark lane, her breath heavy, her fists clenched. Once, a young boy claimed he had seen her chasing a woman across the fields, her voice shrill, her face twisted with fury. Another time, a man swore she had cornered him in the market, screaming curses so foul that the priest himself turned pale when he heard of it. Most people avoided her after that. They lowered their eyes when she passed, unwilling to provoke her wrath. But fear is a strange thing. It does not silence people. Instead, it makes their whispers louder. And so Mary Timney became less a neighbor and more a figure of dread. The brewing storm in the heart of Dumfries, where gossip was as common as bread, Mary's name was spoken like a warning. She's dangerous. She's cursed. She'd bring trouble on herself and on anyone near her. Whether these words were fair or not, they built a wall around Mary, a wall of suspicion, fear, and isolation. And behind that wall, her anger grew stronger. No one knew it then, but fate was moving closer. It would take only one argument, one clash, one violent spark to turn the whispers into screams and the shadows into blood. The streets of Dumfries slept uneasily, but the town could feel it coming, the way animals sense a storm before the first drop of rain. And when that storm finally broke, Mary Timney's name would no longer be a whisper. It would be a headline. It would be a warning. It would be carved into history with the news that awaited her. The violent night, the evening was heavy with silence. Clouds hung low over Dumfries, pressing the sky against the earth, as though nature itself knew what was about to unfold. In the narrow lanes, dogs barked uneasily, and lamps flickered as the wind carried the scent of rain. Mary Timney was restless. For days, her temper had been simmering beneath the surface. Arguments had grown sharper, words more poisonous, and her rage more difficult to cage. The dispute the story began with a quarrel small at first, but sharp enough to cut. Her neighbor, a woman who had lived near Mary for years, had exchanged bitter words with her. Some say it was about land boundaries, others claim it was about insults hurled across fences, but whatever the truth, it struck a nerve deep inside Mary. That evening, voices rose in the dimming light. "You'll not shame me before the town?" Mary screamed, her voice echoing against the stone walls. "And you'll not bring your temper to my door again?" Her neighbor retorted, standing firm. The shouting grew louder, so fierce that passers-by paused in the lane, listening with unease, but none stepped forward. Everyone knew better than to stand between Mary Timney and her fury. Rage unleashed something inside Mary snapped. Perhaps it was years of frustration. Perhaps it was her pride. Perhaps it was the whispers that had followed her all her life. Whatever it was, it exploded with violent force. In a frenzy, she grabbed what she could, a weapon, crude yet deadly. Some said it was a knife, others a heavy object at hand. What mattered was not the weapon, but the fire behind her eyes. Her neighbor screamed, but the night swallowed the sound. The struggle was short, brutal, and bloody. By the time silence returned, a life had been stolen in rage. Mary stood there, chest heaving, hands trembling, her face pale against the firelight. Around her, the shadows seemed to close in, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the act. The aftermath word spread like wildfire through Dumfries. "Mary Timney has done it," people whispered. "She's killed her neighbor." Crowds gathered, murmuring in disbelief, horror etched on their faces. The woman they had feared, the woman they had whispered about, had crossed the line between rumor and reality. The whispers were no longer cautionary tales. They were truth bloody and undeniable. Mary was seized, her arms bound, her face wild with anger, or was it shock? Some claimed she raged even as they dragged her away, spitting curses at those who condemned her. Others swore she was silent, her eyes hollow, as if she already knew the end that awaited her. A town in shock for Dumfries, the act was unthinkable. A woman committing such a violent murder was rare, scandalous, and terrifying. The townsfolk who once avoided Mary now gathered in morbid fascination. They looked at her not as a neighbor, but as a monster unveiled. Children were hushed, women crossed themselves, and men shook their heads. The trial would come, the punishment would be swift, but the memory of that violent night would haunt the town forever. The fog thickened once more, swallowing the lane where the blood had spilled. Dumfries returned to uneasy silence, but nothing was the same. The whispers had ended. Mary Timney's dark past had exploded into reality, and there was no turning back. The gallows were waiting. The trial of fire, the courthouse in Dumfries, was never silent. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk, their faces pale with curiosity and fear. The air was thick, part with the smell of damp wool coats, part with the anticipation of judgment. For weeks, whispers of Mary Timney's crime had flooded the town. But now, those whispers had turned into something sharper. Testimonies, accusations, and the demand for justice. At the center of it all sat Mary. The courtroom scene, she was brought and shackled, her hair unkempt, her expression unreadable. Some claimed she looked defiant, her jaw set as if daring the world to condemn her. Others swore they saw flickers of fear in her eyes, the trembling of a woman who knew the gallows were closer than she could bear. The judge presided in somber robes, his gavel striking wood like thunder. The crowd hushed instantly. The trial of Mary Timney had begun. Witnesses speak one by one. The townsfolk took the stand. "I heard shouting that night," said a neighbor, her voice trembling. Mary's voice, it was like fire tearing through the silence. Another man claimed, "I saw her after her hands. They were stained." He could not finish his words. His face turned pale as he recalled the sight. Children who had been warned about Mary now clung to their mothers in the gallery, eyes wide as they realized the frightening stories were true. The prosecution painted her as dangerous, violent, and consumed by rage. They spoke of her history of quarrels, her temper, her curses that rang through the streets. This crime, the prosecutor declared, was not an accident of passion. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life spent in anger. Mary's defense. Her lawyer, nervous, sweating, tried to argue otherwise. He spoke of her hard life, of poverty and loss, of a woman beaten down by the world until she finally snapped. He pleaded for mercy, painting her not as a monster, but as a human being driven past her breaking point. But the faces of the jury remained grim. The whispers in Dumfries had already condemned her long before the trial began. Mary's own words, when Mary herself was asked to speak, the courtroom leaned forward. She rose slowly, chains clinking against the wooden floor. Her voice, when it came, was steady, though laced with bitterness. "They called me cursed long before I ever raised my hand," she said. "Every word I spoke was twisted. Every shadow cast upon me. Do you think I am the only one in Dumfries who's ever lost their temper? Who's ever struck in anger? No, but I am the one you feared. I am the one you hated. And so now, I am the one you will hang." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. The verdict, it did not take long. The jury returned with their decision, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding Mary's. "Guilty," the foreman announced. The word struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the chamber, prayers whispered, and Mary herself stood motionless. Some said she laughed, a cold, sharp laugh that unsettled even the bravest. Others swore she simply lowered her head, accepting her fate. The judge's voice rang out, "Mary Timney, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul." The waiting. The townsfolk spilled into the streets, their whispers now louder than ever. Dumfries had witnessed many trials, but this one was different. This was not the trial of a thief nor a petty criminal. This was the trial of a woman who had defied the very expectations of her time, who had crossed into violence so severe that the law would make an example of her. Behind the prison walls, Mary awaited her fate. The days ticked by slowly, every hour a reminder of the rope that waited for her. She wrote little, spoke even less, and walked her cell like a caged beast pacing before slaughter. The people of Dumfries waited too, some with fear, some with fascination. For Mary Timney was no longer just a woman. She was a symbol, and soon she would become a spectacle. Behind prison walls, the stone walls of Dumfries jail stood cold and unyielding, rising above the town like a warning. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the stench of mildew, iron, and hopelessness. For most prisoners, the cell was a place of despair. But for Mary Timney, it became something else, an arena where she wrestled with her past, her anger, and the shadow of death that grew closer each day. Life in the cell. Her cell was small, little more than a dark box with a straw mattress, a bucket, and a single slit of a window through which only the faintest light crept. At night, rats scurried across the stones. By day, the silence was broken only by the clang of keys and the occasional shouts of guards. Mary spent her hours pacing, back and forth, back and forth. Her footsteps on the stone echoed like a drumbeat of fate. She would mutter to herself, sometimes cursing under her breath, other times whispering things no one could quite understand. Letters and confessions clergymen visited her cell, urging her to repent, to seek forgiveness before the end. Some claimed she mocked them, laughing bitterly at their holy words. Others swore she wept when she thought no one was looking, clutching at the thin blanket on her bed like a child. There were rumors that she wrote letters, angry letters filled with accusations against those who testified, and softer ones begging her family for understanding. Whether those letters survived is a mystery, but their existence added to her legend. A town obsessed, outside the prison walls, Dumfries was alive with gossip. Crowds gathered daily just to glimpse the prison, as though the stone walls themselves might whisper secrets. Children dared each other to run up and touch the gates. Merchants sold bread and ale near the courthouse. Knowing the fascination with Mary's case was drawing people from neighboring villages. Some argued she deserved no mercy, that her crime was unforgivable. Others, especially women, whispered that perhaps society had made her into what she became, that years of scorn, isolation, and hardship had hardened her into something violent. But whatever their opinion, they all agreed on one thing. They would be there on the day of her hanging. The weight of waiting. For Mary, time was no longer days and nights. It was a slow march toward the scaffold. Each sunrise brought her closer to the noose. At times, she seemed calm, even defiant, staring through the window slit as though daring the world outside to forget her. At other times, the guards heard her cry out in the dark, her voice cracking with rage and grief. One guard later swore he heard her mutter, "They made me the monster. Now they will watch me die as one." The final preparations, as the date of execution drew near, preparations began in the town square. A wooden scaffold was built, its beams rising against the sky like a grim monument. Carpenters hammered under the gaze of curious crowds, each strike of the mallet echoing across Dumfries like a countdown. For the townsfolk, it was morbid entertainment. For Mary, it was the shape of her destiny. The prison bell tolled, deep and mournful. Inside her cell, Mary Timney closed her eyes and waited. The noose was ready. The crowd was gathering. The end was almost here. The day of the hanging, the morning of the execution dawned gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over Dumfries, as though even the heavens mourned what was about to unfold. The chill in the air carried with it the sound of hammering. The scaffold was ready, looming over the town square like a grim stage. The gathering crowd by sunrise, the people began to pour into the square. Farmers, merchants, mothers holding their children, even travelers from neighboring towns. Everyone came to witness what they called history in the making. Vendors shouted, selling bread, cider, and hot pies, their voices cutting through the murmur of the gathering crowd. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to catch a glimpse of the wooden structure that promised both justice and spectacle. By midday, thousands had gathered. The square was thick with anticipation. A sea of faces turned toward the gallows. Some were eager, some horrified, but none could look away. The walk to the scaffold inside Dumfries jail. Mary Timney's cell door creaked open. Guards entered, their expressions stern but uneasy. Few had ever escorted a woman to the gallows. Mary emerged slowly. Chains clinked at her wrists and ankles, but her back was straight, her eyes fixed forward. Some said she looked proud, defiant even. Others whispered she appeared pale, her lips trembling ever so slightly as though fear gnawed at her beneath the surface. The chaplain walked beside her, murmuring prayers. "Seek God's mercy, Mary," he urged. But she did not reply. The streets from the prison to the scaffold were lined with spectators. As Mary was led forward, the crowd erupted in murmurs. Some jeered, shouting curses. Others watched in silence, stunned by the sight of a woman walking to her death. The final words, at the base of the scaffold, the executioner waited. The wooden steps creaked as Mary ascended, her chains rattling with each movement. The square hushed. The hangman adjusted the noose, the rope swaying in the breeze like a serpent. The chaplain offered her the chance to speak. Mary's eyes scanned the crowd, thousands of faces staring at her, some with hatred, some with pity, and some with morbid fascination. She raised her chin and spoke, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You call me a monster, but I was made one by your scorn. You whisper of my temper, but you fed it with your hatred. I die not only for what I have done, but for what you all made of me. Remember this day not as the day Mary Timney fell, but the day you saw what your cruelty creates." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some gasped. Some shouted in anger, but all listened. The moment the executioner placed the noose around her neck, the rope scratched against her skin, cold and final. The hood was lowered, shrouding her face in darkness. The crowd held its breath. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor fell open with a thunderous crack. For a moment, the square was silent. Then, as Mary's body swung, cries erupted, some in shock, some in satisfaction. Children wept, women turned away, and men nodded grimly. Mary Timney was dead. The aftermath, the executioner cut her body down after the appointed time, laying her to rest in the cold earth. But for Dumfries, her death was only the beginning of her legend. People whispered of the speech she gave, of the fire in her eyes, of the way the rope creaked, as if even the gallows groaned beneath her fury. Some claimed they heard her curses echo long after the crowd had dispersed. Others swore her ghost haunted the prison walls, pacing restlessly, forever chained. Mary Timney was gone, but her name, her crime, and her execution would live on for centuries as one of Scotland's darkest tales. Legacy of fear. When Mary Timney's body was taken down from the scaffold, Dumfries exhaled in unison. But the silence that followed was heavier than the execution itself. For the people of Dumfries, the hanging of a woman was no ordinary event. It was a memory carved deep into the soul of the town. The town's reaction in the days that followed, Dumfries was divided. Some celebrated her death as justice served. The town is safer now, they said. The curse is broken. For them, Mary Timney was a villain whose violent end was nothing more than she deserved, but others whispered of unease. Mothers tucked their children into bed and shivered when the wind howled through the streets. Some swore they heard footsteps near the gallows at night, the clinking of invisible chains, or the faint sound of a woman's bitter laughter. The taverns filled with retellings of her final speech, each version darker and more twisted than the last. She cursed us all, some claimed. Her words were not the words of a mortal woman, they were a prophecy. From history to folklore, in official records, Mary Timney's name was written plainly, a criminal executed for murder, a warning, a statistic. But in the folklore of Dumfries, she became something far more powerful. She was remembered as the last woman publicly executed in the town. That fact alone gave her story a chilling immortality. Children grew up with warnings, behave or Mary Timney will come for you. Women spoke of her as a victim of a cruel society that punished her more harshly for being female. Men spoke of her as a monster whose rage consumed her. Each telling of her story grew more theatrical, more ghostly, until Mary Timney was no longer just a woman, she was a legend. The ghost of Dumfries years later, travelers passing through Dumfries claimed the prison was haunted. Guards reported strange knocks on doors, icy drafts, and whispers in the dark. Some swore they saw a figure pacing the corridors, chains rattling, head bowed beneath an invisible noose. The scaffold itself was eventually dismantled, its wood reused. Yet those who owned the planks claimed strange misfortunes followed them: sickness, financial ruin, unexplained deaths. People said the curse of Mary Timney lingered in the very wood of the gallows. The eternal debate, even now, historians and storytellers argue about who Mary Timney really was. Was she truly a violent murderer consumed by rage? Or was she a victim of her time, punished more for her defiance than for her crime? Was her execution justice, or was it society's cruelty disguised as law? One truth remains: her story has never been forgotten. The final image centuries later, when the streets of Dumfries grow quiet at night, locals say you can still hear it. The faint rhythm of footsteps pacing stone floors, and the creak of a rope swaying in the wind. Mary Timney may have died on the gallows that day, but her shadow never left Dumfries. She remains forever the ghost of Scotland's darkest justice.